Welcome to Chapter 2, where we will be looking at agriculture today and how we have come pretty far from the way we started agriculture and talk about what is in our future for the next 20, 30 years. Here are the 5 major points that we'll talk about in this chapter. We will evaluate what a farm is defined as. We'll look at what a farmer is defined as. We'll look at land use in the United States and importance of farming, and then in turn looking at some policy for farming in the United States, and talk a little bit of government as well. All right, so big thing that I want you to get here are those big first 2 bullets. Actually, all of them are very important. So, farms are defined by how they are used. So if they're used to farm ground or to graze livestock, we look at stewardship. So there's a lot of different policies and regulations now put into how we utilize water, how we utilize land. There are soil conservation programs out there that the USDA and NRCS has given young farmers and ranchers. And then of course the economics, how we're going to make money at this is kind of the bottom line, because if we don't make any money, we're not putting food on our own plate. So that's really important. So that's what farms are defined as. And one of the coolest things I think about American agriculture is that we have so many different people coming from different backgrounds and economic statuses that farm. So we're looking at urban farmers that are wanting to grow their own food in very urban areas, to very rural farms who, these people will farm 7,000-8,000 acres, and they come from different backgrounds, they're different genders, they're just different people. And so anybody and everybody can do it. This isn't something that you have to, you're kind of born into. There is a thing as a first generation farmer. So that's really important. And then we'll talk a little bit about in lecture this week or in class this week about national security and how important it is to farming and how farming is really important to national security. I'm sure these last couple years you've heard a lot about national security, about the border, about how much we're giving, how much we're taking from or importing and exporting from different countries, and that has a lot to do with our economy, which in turn will have a lot to do with our national security. And so we'll look a little bit about that, and then there's some questions in your assignment this week that we'll look at that as well. So also with that, we have federal farm policies that really support that farmer and rancher and help reduce the risk. If you come from a farming family, you've heard of subsidies, you've heard of different programs that you can get involved in to make sure that if something drastic happens, weather's really bad, or we get a giant snowstorm like our friends up north did this last year and lost hundreds of thousands of cattle. They have different policy programs that are designed to help them get back on track, and that's really important. And I think a lot of times our federal government is not looked upon in a positive light, but if you really get down in the nitty gritty, they really do try and help out farmers and ranchers in the United States. And sure, of course, there's flaws, but they really try to help and make sure that if something does go bad, they're there to help pull that farmer and rancher out. Thing when it comes to a farm or a ranch, and the average Joe in Tulsa might not know the difference, and so we're going to kind of differentiate the difference here. So a farm is just a plot of land that is devoted for agriculture, whether that is raising livestock or raising crops. It is a place where humans, you and I, practice stewardship of the land, because that's what a farm is. We're practicing the stewardship, and then we're trying to make a little bit of money on it as well. So the big thing that, what Webster's dictionary, whatever, the political, I guess, definition is any place that $1,000 or more of agriculture products are sold annually. So that's what the USDA defines it. That's what the government defines it as. That's what different ag entities define it as. So, for example, let's say I wanted to start growing tomatoes. Let's say Roma tomatoes, and that's how I wanted to make a side gig. and I didn't have a farm. I didn't live on a farm currently. And so I'm going to buy a couple acres. I'm going to turn it into a giant garden, and I'm going to grow tomatoes, Roma tomatoes. And if I sell $1,001 of those Roma tomatoes, that is considered a farm. So I could get in contact with the USDA, the FSA office, and they would consider me a farm because that's how much money I made. And so then I would be able to, for example, deduct different things on my taxes, whether I used a herbicide, a pesticide. I could deduct all of those things. So $1,000 or more of ag products that are sold within one calendar year. So for different people, it's kind of different when you look at the calendar year, but typically it's January 1st to the end of December. Every 5 years, really, but there's roughly 2.1 million farms in the United States. So when you look at that on a wide scale, if you look at it for like average size, it's about 444 acres for an average size of farm ground. Now, of course, that's going to be extremely different from the east to the west. In the east, there's very, very little farm ground. And so those acres, a big farm out there might be 300 acres or 400 acres. But in Texas or anywhere out west, that would be considered small. So obviously Texas has the most, New Jersey will have the least. When you look at the sales class, USDA defines 5 of them, and we'll look at those in just a minute. So again, when you're looking at the sizes, the East usually has a smaller amount of farms or the smaller acres in average size, and then the largest is more out. So here are those farms by region, and we have north, we have west, we have south, north central. I think I said north first. Sorry, north central, northeast, south, and then west. And so when you look on how these are divided, you can see. Let's just look at the south real quick. So 42.2% are farms, and then 30.4% land. Okay, so that is the difference between farms and then just land. So maybe land that people own, but they don't farm it. So 42.2% are farms, 30.4% is land. If you look at the Northeast there, 6.5% are farms, 2.1% are land. And then if you look out west, 14.8% farms, 30.3% land, North Central, 36.5% farms, and then 37.2% land. So obviously pretty different in terms of how it's divided throughout the United States, but pretty interesting the way you look at those numbers and how they are solidifying and growing within agriculture today. Currently, so when I was growing up, it was 2% of the U.S. population is in farming, and that's their main occupation. Now it is only 1%. 1% of the U.S. population had their full-time job is farming. And when I say full-time job, if you have a married couple, both of those people that are turning in taxes together, they are sole farmers. They have no job in town. They don't do anything on the side. They're just farming. So 1% of the U.S. population is doing that. That's kind of a crazy number, especially with the way our population is growing. As we start to get closer to 2050, we're starting to see a lot more people and less farms. So even 15 years ago when I was growing up, it was 2% and now it's 1%. So kind of crazy, but one of the coolest things that I think is really neat about farming is 98% of farms are family run. And so they still have many or few of that family farm in their name. So that's pretty important. And there are a lot of big ag companies, like Purdue Chicken and different types of farms that are still considered to be a family farm because they're family run. So that's pretty neat. Another thing that I think is just awesome is you can be any race, gender, age, doesn't matter. As long as you have a love for agriculture, you are you're able to farm here, and that's kind of the American dream. And we'll talk a little bit more of that in class this week. But that's something that's really important to me, and to know that, you know, if my kid wants to farm, she's more than able to do that. 50 years ago, even 50 years ago, that probably would have been frowned upon, but now we're lucky enough and blessed enough to be able to do that. So when you look at the household income, and this is, I just want to share this with you. This is before taxes. So this is before those taxes are done. So U.S. Farm household income is about 90,000 in 2007. I put that up there because that hasn't fluctuated much. I think it's like 91,000 and some change, but that was in 2007. So about 10 years later, it really hasn't moved. Prices have moved, but that has not moved because there's a little bit more money taken out than bringing in. But again, that's before taxes. So before you have to go pay all those fun people that help you out throughout the year, then you'll bank about $90,000. And then, you know, there's different diverse income streams. So within that $90,000, there's probably a spouse that works in town, like myself. I work at NEO and love it, and it's my dream job, but that's incorporated within that household income with that U.S. Farm household as well. So there's many different ways that you can get that income as well. So, for example, we have some hay ground, we have a ranch, and, you know, there's different ways to get that income in as well. But, you know, one of the big things is banking that at the end of the year and trying to pay all those bills and then pay the tax man if you have to. This is a map that's going to show you the average farm size by state, and we're looking at this in terms of acres. So if you look at Oklahoma, the average farm size in 2009 was 406 acres. So I want you to look and see what state you're from. If that's from Oklahoma, you can see that it's 406 acres. But if it's somewhere else, look at that number. So I was born in Indiana, and grew up in Indiana. So my average farm size in Indiana is 241. So pretty big difference when you're looking at Oklahoma compared to Indiana. Now look out west there. You can see just Nevada, a little over 1,900 acres per farm. All right. So Arizona, New Mexico, those are pretty big. Montana. Then you look more so in the eastern part of the United States. Rhode Island, 57. Connecticut, 82. So just the sizes there, we see a lot of difference. But there's also a lot of difference of crops that are grown in those areas as well. If you're looking at this on a U.S. scale, 418 acres per farm is what the average would be. So livestock and crops, anything that has to do with food, fiber, and feeding the world, we use 50% of the land, 50% of the United States. But of that 50%, less than 25%, I think it's 24.1% of U.S. land is cropland. So we are growing all of the crops that we grow on less than 25% of the land. And so that's kind of crazy when you break that down. It's 440 million acres of crop ground. So, and then you can look there, and this is in your book too, about 10% is pasture land, and then 75% is just mechanically harvested crops. So, you know, what we have to go in and harvest. 10% is idled cropland, so it's not doing anything. It's just sitting, right? It's maybe going back into a native pasture type thing. So, and we talked about how it varies by region, but cropland is pretty intense in the Midwest, and so that's pretty important to us here in Oklahoma. Forest land is more in areas of the east, and then pasture and rangeland is more in the southwest, and that's kind of how they have those big numbers as well. So this is per 1,000 acres, and then the pretty important crops of the United States. So look down there, you can see potatoes. So we're about 50,000 areas of harvest, or 50,000 acres are in potatoes. If you look at the production quantity, down there on that second graph, you look at corn. That is a lot, right? That is that production quantity will forever probably outrun wheat and rice in the United States, just because it's easier for us to grow. We kind of got it figured out. We're smart human beings and can grow it pretty easily, and are able to grow more on less land, which is really important as well. And so that's just a pretty cool map to show you that quantity. Right, so there are 25 crops that are really vital to the United States and how we buy, sell, trade, and do a little bit different policy negotiations as well. The four main ones that I really want you to know are soybeans, wheat, hay, and corn. Now, some of you are going to be like, "Hey, that's a ranchy thing. That's what we feed cattle and livestock," but that is still considered a crop, and we still sell it, and that is very, very important to the United States economy and as well as agriculture. So hay is actually on more than half of the crop ground as well. So if you take that 25% that we just talked about, that's crop ground, you cut that in half, that is mostly hay, which is kind of crazy when you look at it. And then you could look at 8 other crops there. If you can those all together, that would be a value of over $1 billion. So sugar beets, rice, tobacco, those all have a production value of $1 billion. Dairy, cattle, sheep, and goats. Unfortunately, our dairy friends have had a couple rough years and have seen a lot of changes within state governments and the federal government to make it a little harder on them to have those dairy cattle and to follow all the regulations, but they're pulling through, and they're doing what they need to do on the policy side, so that's good. Livestock, we feed them anything from soybean meal, we feed them haylage, hay, corn, and then poultry obviously will eat some high energy feeds as well. So the livestock are using exactly what we grow, and then they will grow and we will eat them. So importance of farming. So one thing that I really want you all to know, and not just know, I want you to really appreciate this. And I'm sure you've seen it on social media. I'm sure you've heard this from different people. But each farmer in the United States produces food and fiber for 150 people. Okay, that's awesome. 150 people they are providing that for, and it contributes to 140 billion, or 1% of the GDP. And that, in terms of economics in America, is huge. You might think 1%, Allison, that's not much, but $140 billion is huge. But the crazy thing is, when you look at pay and income, the Americans, pay less than 10% of their income on food, and that's less than anywhere in the world. And so you could really look at that in terms of how we eat. So if you go to McDonald's, you can order off the dollar menu. They don't have a dollar menu in a lot of other places in the world, but we do in America, because we can utilize food for cheap. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in lecture as well. So while we're talking about importance of farming, there are 4 major aspects that we'll look at. We will talk about the economic impact of farming, the good and the bad. We'll look at exports versus imports and what the difference is between the two. We'll look at ag jobs and agribusiness. All right, so economic impact, if you look here, you can look at the percent of GDP versus the percent of jobs. I want you to look down there at farms, okay? So in 1972, 11% of the GDP, we just said that 1% of the GDP is now, that's about 140 billion. Now it's 6, okay? Percent of jobs in 1972 it was 14, and now in 2018, this is a little skewed because it's 2001, but now it's about 6, which is pretty crazy. And then you can definitely see a little bit more growth in all of those other areas of business as well.